When love becomes desperation, Scout Kane's courtroom confession shakes Port Charles. The courtroom on Monday, October 20, 2025, was thick with tension as the residents of Port Charles gathered for what they believed would be a routine arraignment. Willow Tate and Nina Reeves stood before Judge Carson, both women accused in connection with the shooting of Congressman Drew Kane Quatermain. The prosecution had laid out their case methodically: the gun found at Elizabeth Baldwin's house, the crumbling alibis, the motive born from betrayal and blackmail. Everyone expected legal maneuvering, perhaps a plea deal, maybe even dramatic testimony. No one expected what happened next. As the judge prepared to render her decision on bail and scheduling, a small voice pierced through the heavy silence from the back of the courtroom. "Don't hurt Willow's mom. It's my fault." Every head turned. There, standing with tears streaming down her face, was Scout Kane, all of 14 years old, her slight frame trembling as she stepped forward from where she'd been sitting with the family. Elizabeth Baldwin, who had been caring for Scout along with Willow, gasped in horror, half rising from her seat. "I shot Dad. I took Grandpa Edward's gun and I shot Dad twice," Scout continued, her voice breaking but determined. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs, but Scout pressed on, her words tumbling out in a desperate confession. "Dad separated me from my family. He wouldn't let me see Grandma Alexis, or Aunt Christina, or Aunt Molly, or my brother Danny, or Rocco. Mom just died, and Dad took away everyone I had left. I didn't have any other choice." The silence that followed was suffocating. Anna Devane and Dante Falconeri exchanged urgent glances. District Attorney Jennifer Randall stood frozen, her carefully prepared case suddenly thrown into chaos. Michael Corinthos, who many suspected had orchestrated Willow's frame-up, looked genuinely shocked. Even Drew, still recovering from his injuries and present via video link from his hospital room, appeared stunned into speechlessness. Elizabeth finally found her voice. "Scout, no. You don't know what you're saying," she cried out, moving toward the girl. But Scout shook her head firmly, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "I know exactly what I'm saying," Scout insisted. "I know what I did. Dad wouldn't listen when I begged him to let me visit Monica before she died. He kept saying, later, and soon, but later never came. And then Grandma Monica was gone, and I never got to say goodbye." Her voice cracked with fresh grief. "Mom died less than a year ago. I lost my mother, and instead of helping me, Dad took away everyone else I love. He got restraining orders against my own family. Against Grandma Alexis, who raised Mom. Against Danny, my own brother." Judge Carson raised her gavel, attempting to restore order. "Young lady, you need to stop speaking immediately. You are not under oath, and you have not been advised of your rights." But Scout wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and months of grief, isolation, and desperation poured out. "I went to the Q mansion during camp. Danny and Charlotte helped me sneak out because I missed my family so much. I knew where Grandpa Edward kept his guns because I'd seen them before. I took one. I was so angry. At Dad for taking my whole life away. At Dad for spending all his time with Willow instead of being there when I had nightmares about Mom. At Dad for trying to make Willow my new mom when I wasn't ready." The courtroom was in pandemonium now. Alexis Davis had tears streaming down her face, her hands pressed to her mouth. Dante was already on his radio, calling for backup and juvenile authorities. Sonny Corinthos sat rigid with shock, while Carly Spencer's expression showed both horror and heartbreak for the traumatized girl. Anna Devane stood and addressed the bench. "Your Honor, I respectfully request an immediate recess. This young woman is a minor and needs to be properly advised of her rights. We also need to conduct a thorough investigation of these claims before proceeding." District Attorney Randall quickly added, "The people agree, Your Honor. Given the circumstances and the defendant's age, this requires immediate intervention from juvenile authorities and mental health professionals." Judge Carson nodded gravely. "Bailiff, please escort Miss Kane to a private chamber. I want a juvenile advocate here immediately, along with her legal guardian and a licensed counselor. This proceeding is recessed until we can determine the veracity and voluntariness of this statement." She turned her stern gaze to the packed courtroom. "And I want absolute silence about what has just occurred until we have properly evaluated this situation. That means no press conferences, no social media posts. This is a minor child we're dealing with." As the bailiff gently approached Scout, Elizabeth moved to the girl's side, wrapping a protective arm around her shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart. We're going to get you help," she whispered. Scout sagged against her, the weight of what she'd just done seeming to suddenly crash down upon her. But before the bailiff could escort them out, Jordan Ashford stepped forward. Your Honor, before we proceed, the PCPD has been conducting a thorough investigation into Congressman Kane's shooting. I believe we need to examine the evidence before accepting any confession at face value. Anna nodded in agreement. Commissioner Ashford is correct. We need to review the ballistics evidence immediately. The evidence doesn't lie. Within hours, the ballistics team had delivered their preliminary findings, and what they revealed would change everything. Dr. Ellen Martinez, the forensic ballistics expert, stood in the police conference room with Anna, Jordan, Dante, and Harrison Chase gathered around her. Based on the trajectory analysis and the force required, there's simply no way Scout Kane could have fired those shots, Dr. Martinez stated flatly, pulling up images on her tablet. The weapon in question, Edward Quatermain's .45 caliber pistol, has significant recoil and requires substantial hand strength to operate effectively. The angle of entry for both bullets indicates the shooter was approximately 5'8" to 5'10", firing from a standing position approximately 12 feet from the victim. She pulled up another image. Scout Kane is, according to her medical records, 5'2" and weighs 98 pounds. More importantly, when we tested her grip strength, which we were able to do with her advocate present, she doesn't have the hand strength necessary to properly pull the trigger on this particular weapon, let alone maintain control through the recoil to fire a second accurate shot. Anna's expression was grim. So she's protecting someone. Or she genuinely believes she did it due to trauma and wished thinking, added Dr. Elaine Chen, the child psychologist who had been rushed in to evaluate Scout. I've spent the last 2 hours with Scout. That girl is drowning in grief, guilt, and abandonment trauma. She lost her mother less than a year ago in a traumatic medical procedure gone wrong. Then her father, her only remaining parent, effectively cut her off from every support system she had, her grandmother, her aunts, her brother, even her stepbrother Rocco who she'd been living with before Sam's death. Dr. Chen continued, her voice heavy with professional concern. Scout has expressed to me that she feels responsible for being a burden to her father. She believes that if she confesses to the shooting, 2 things will happen. 1, she'll fix the problem of Drew having to deal with her by going into juvenile detention, and 2, she'll save Willow, who has been one of the few people showing her genuine kindness and maternal care in recent months. So you're saying the confession is false? Chase asked. I'm saying Scout is a severely traumatized 14-year-old girl who has been psychologically damaged by isolation, grief, and parental neglect, Dr. Chen replied firmly. She's exhibiting signs of complex trauma and possibly developing depression. The confession appears to be what we call a sacrifice confession. She's trying to take blame to either protect someone she cares about or to punish herself for perceived failures. Young people who have experienced significant loss sometimes engage in self-destructive behaviors as a way of externalizing internal pain. Jordan pulled up the timeline on the whiteboard. We know Scout was at the youth camp the night of the shooting. Multiple counselors have confirmed she was present at bed check. The camp is 45 minutes away from Drew's house. Could she have snuck out? Dante suggested, though his tone indicated he doubted it. Possible but unlikely, Jordan replied. The camp has security logs. No vehicles left the property that night, and it would have been a 90-minute walk each way. She would have had to leave by 7 p.m. to make it to Drew's house by the time of the shooting at approximately 9:15 p.m., then get back by morning bed check at 7 a.m. The counselors reported seeing her at the evening recreational activity that ended at 8:30 p.m. Anna tapped her pen against the table thoughtfully. So we have a false confession from a traumatized child who physically couldn't have committed the crime and likely wasn't even present. Which brings us back to our original suspects. And the question of whether Michael Corinthos planted that gun to frame Willow, Chase added, his jaw tight. Scout has been living at Elizabeth's house with Willow. She would have seen the gun if Michael planted it there. Maybe that's why she thinks she did it. She saw the weapon and her traumatized mind convinced her she must have been the one who used it. The real investigation begins. With Scout's confession deemed unreliable due to both physical impossibility and her psychological state, the investigation refocused on the original suspects. But the young girl's desperate attempt to take the blame had inadvertently shone a spotlight on several uncomfortable truths about the case, and about Drew Kane himself. As Scout was placed in the temporary care of a specialized foster facility equipped to handle traumatized youth, the adult residents of Port Charles had to confront what had driven a child to such desperation. That girl tried to confess to attempted murder to escape her own father, Alexis said to Diane Miller in a hushed conversation outside the courtroom. What does that tell you about Drew's parenting? Diane's expression was grave. It tells me we may need to file for emergency custody. No child should feel that taking the blame for a violent crime is preferable to living with their own parent. Meanwhile, in the hospital, Drew was finally forced to confront the consequences of his actions, not the shooting, but everything he'd done to Scout in the months since Sam's death. The realization that his daughter had been so desperate, so isolated, so traumatized that she'd tried to confess to shooting him had shaken something loose in the congressman. For the first time in months, Drew Cain was beginning to see himself as others saw him, not as the victim of a shooting, but as a man who had prioritized his political ambitions and his inappropriate relationship with his nephew's wife over his grieving daughter's basic emotional needs. Back at the PCPD, Anna and her team continued piecing together the real story. The gun had indeed been taken from the Quatermain mansion, but not by Scout. Security footage that had initially been overlooked showed someone entering through the garden entrance the day before the shooting, someone whose build and height matched the ballistics profile much more closely than Scout's did. We've been so focused on who had motive that we forgot to focus on who had means and opportunity, Anna mused, studying the blurry footage. And we let a traumatized child nearly sacrifice herself because we weren't paying attention to the whole picture. Jordan nodded. The question now is, who was Scout trying to protect? Was it Willow? Michael? Or someone else entirely? The investigation was far from over, but one thing had become crystal clear: Scout Cain's heartbreaking confession in that courtroom had been a wake-up call for everyone in Port Charles. A child should never feel so alone, so desperate, so unloved that confessing to attempted murder seems like a reasonable solution to her problems. The aftermath and moving forward. In the days following the courtroom incident, several developments unfolded that would reshape the lives of many Port Charles residents. Judge Carson ordered a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Scout and mandated that Drew Cain undergo parenting counseling and supervised visitation until Scout's mental health team determined she was ready for regular contact, if she ever wanted it. Alexis Davis, with Diane Miller's help, filed for emergency grandparental custody, citing Drew's emotional neglect and Scout's expressed desire to be with family members who actually prioritized her well-being. The judge granted temporary custody to Alexis while the case worked its way through family court. For the first time since her mother's death, Scout was surrounded by people who put her needs first. She was reunited with Danny, who had been beside himself with worry. Christina and Molly visited regularly, bringing familiar faces and unconditional love. And slowly, painfully slowly, Scout began to heal. Dr. Chen continued to work with Scout, helping her process her grief over losing Sam, her anger at Drew's abandonment, and her guilt over the desperate confession. What you did in that courtroom, Dr. Chen told Scout during one of their sessions, wasn't weakness. It was a cry for help from someone who'd been silenced for too long. Now we're going to make sure you're heard. As for the shooting investigation, it continued with renewed focus. Willow was released when the DA's office acknowledged that the evidence against her was circumstantial at best and possibly planted. Nina's charges were similarly dropped. The real shooter remained at large, but Anna Devane was determined to find them, this time without accepting easy answers that put innocent people, especially children, in jeopardy. Michael Corinthos faced his own reckoning. While not charged with any crime, the investigation into whether he'd planted evidence continued. More importantly, he had to confront what his obsessive need for revenge against Drew and Willow had almost cost an innocent, traumatized child. Dark Michael was beginning to see that some victories aren't worth the collateral damage they cause. And Drew? He sat in his hospital room, recovering from his physical wounds while being forced to acknowledge much deeper damage he'd inflicted, on his daughter, on his family relationships, on his own humanity. Whether he could find redemption remained to be seen, but Scout's tearful confession had accomplished something months of confrontations hadn't. It had cracked through his narcissistic armor and shown him the true cost of his selfish choices. The courtroom confession that shocked Port Charles had ended without any arrests, without any convictions. But it had revealed a truth more important than solving the crime, that in the pursuit of adult vendettas and political ambitions, the most vulnerable among them, the children, were being forgotten and damaged in ways that might take years to heal. Scout Cain's brave, heartbreaking attempt to protect the people who had shown her kindness by sacrificing herself had been the wake-up call Port Charles needed. Now the real work would begin, not just solving a crime, but healing a family torn apart by grief, ambition, and neglect. As Alexis held her granddaughter that first night in her restored custody, Scout finally asked the question she'd been holding back: "Grandma, why didn't Dad love me enough to let me stay with my family?" Alexis had no easy answer, but she held Scout close and promised her the one thing the girl needed most: "You are loved, sweetheart. You are so loved. And I will make sure you never feel alone again." And for Scout Kane, that promise was the beginning of finding her way back from the darkness that had almost consumed her entirely. Next, the lights flickered in Alexis Davis's basement for 30 long days. 30 days of isolation. 30 days of psychological warfare. 30 days that would transform Rick Lansing from a cunning attorney into something far more sinister, a calculating predator driven by vengeance and madness. When Cody Bell finally discovered Rick stumbling near the cellar door, disheveled and disoriented, Port Charles breathed a collective sigh of relief. The kidnapping ordeal was over. Rick was safe. But those who knew him best, those who looked into his eyes during those first moments of freedom, saw something that made their blood run cold. The Rick Lansing they knew was gone, replaced by a hollow shell housing something darker. The breaking point. The rescue should have been the end of the nightmare. Instead, it was merely the beginning. Rick sat across from the PCPD psychologist, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his voice calm and measured as he recounted his ordeal. He described the ball gag, the restraints, the forced sedatives. He spoke of Ava's mocking laughter, Christina's bitter accusations, and Alexis's cold justifications. The psychologist scribbled notes, recommended therapy, and cleared him for release. What she failed to see was the meticulous calculation behind his composed facade. During those 30 days in darkness, Rick's brilliant legal mind hadn't shut down, it had evolved. Hour after hour, he had replayed every moment of his captivity, every humiliation, every betrayal. And in that darkness, a plan had taken shape. Not a plan for legal retribution or public exposure. No, Rick had moved beyond such civilized notions. He had discovered something pure in his suffering, the intoxicating clarity of revenge. But Rick understood a fundamental truth that separated him from common criminals. Killing Alexis, Ava, and Christina would be too merciful, too quick. Death would end their suffering in an instant. Where was the justice in that? Where was the poetry? No, Rick would do something far more creative. He would make them live with their choices. He would make them feel the same helplessness, the same terror, the same soul-crushing despair that he had experienced in that basement. He would kill the people they loved most. The first victim, TJ's final hours. TJ Ashford had always been one of Port Charles's bright spots, a dedicated doctor, a loving partner to Molly, a young man who embodied hope and decency. He was also the perfect first target. It happened on a Thursday evening. TJ finished his shift at General Hospital and texted Molly that he'd pick up dinner on the way home. Security footage would later show him walking to his car in the parking garage, completely unaware of the figure watching from the shadows. The camera caught a brief struggle, a flash of movement, and then nothing. TJ's body was discovered 3 days later in a warehouse near the docks. The crime scene was pristine, no fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. But the brutality of the act spoke volumes. TJ hadn't died quickly. The medical examiner's report, sealed to protect the family, revealed a methodical torture that suggested the killer had medical knowledge and unlimited time. Molly collapsed when she heard the news, her anguished screams echoing through Alexis's house where the family had gathered. Alexis held her devastated daughter, feeling the weight of guilt crushing her chest. In her darkest thoughts, she wondered if this was connected to Rick, but pushed the idea away. Rick was angry, yes, but he couldn't, do something like this. Still, a small voice whispered in the back of her mind, remembering the look in his eyes when he confronted her with that knife. She had seen something broken in him then, something that frightened her more than she cared to admit. Christina attended the funeral in a daze, watching Molly sob over TJ's casket. The two sisters had been estranged since the loss of Christina's surrogate baby, but grief has a way of temporarily bridging even the widest chasms. As Christina hugged Molly, offering hollow words of comfort, she felt eyes on her. She turned, scanning the crowd of mourners, but saw nothing unusual. Just the sensation of being watched, studied, hunted. Rick stood among the mourners, his face a mask of appropriate sympathy. He had sent flowers, white lilies, Molly's favorite, with a card expressing his deepest condolences. He shook hands, accepted embraces, and played the role of concerned father perfectly. Only he knew the truth, this was just the opening move. The disappearance of Molly. The funeral was on a Monday. By Friday, Molly was gone. Her disappearance was more subtle than TJ's murder, more psychologically devastating. Molly simply vanished from her apartment, leaving behind her phone, her purse, and a half-finished cup of tea still warm on the counter. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no clues. It was as if she had evaporated into thin air. The search began immediately. Dante Falconeri coordinated with the PCPD, organizing search parties and reviewing every piece of available surveillance footage. Alexis was frantic, calling everyone Molly knew, retracing her daughter's steps, refusing to sleep or eat. The guilt that had whispered after TJ's death now screamed in her mind. Two tragedies, both connected to her family, both happening within days of each other. The mathematical probability of coincidence was shrinking to nothing. Christina threw herself into the search, posting flyers, organizing volunteers, doing anything to avoid the terrible thoughts that kept creeping into her consciousness. But late at night, when the house was quiet and she lay awake in her childhood bedroom, she couldn't escape the creeping dread. Someone was targeting them. Someone who knew exactly how to cause the maximum amount of pain. Ava received the first message 3 days after Molly's disappearance. It came via an untraceable email containing a single photograph, Molly, alive but unconscious, in what appeared to be a concrete room. No demands, no explanation, just that single haunting image. Ava stared at her computer screen, her hands trembling. She knew, with absolute certainty, who was behind this. And she knew she couldn't go to the police without revealing her role in Rick's captivity. She called an emergency meeting with Alexis and Christina at Windmere, choosing the remote location for privacy. The three women sat in the Gothic drawing room, each bearing the weight of their collective sin. "It's Rick," Ava said, her voice flat. "This is his revenge." Christina wanted to argue, but the words died in her throat. Deep down, she had known from the moment TJ's body was found. Alexis sat in silence, tears streaming down her face, the full horror of what they had set in motion finally crashing over her. Christina's living nightmare. The video arrived in Christina's inbox on a Tuesday morning. At first, she thought it was spam and almost deleted it. But something made her click the link. The video player opened, and Christina's blood turned to ice. Blaze, her girlfriend who was supposed to be on tour, living her dream, was bound to a chair in a dimly lit room. Her face was bruised, her eyes wide with terror, and duct tape covered her mouth. But she was alive, and that small mercy made what came next even more devastating. A figure moved into frame, face obscured by shadows. The voice was electronically distorted, but the words were clear: "Watch closely, Christina. This is what happens when you play God with people's lives." What followed was 20 minutes of systematic torture. Not physical violence, Rick was too clever for that, but psychological torment that would leave no visible scars. The video showed Blaze being forced to watch fabricated footage of Christina with someone else, hear fake audio of Christina saying she never loved her, and read falsified text suggesting the entire relationship had been a lie. By the end of the video, Blaze was sobbing uncontrollably, her mind clearly breaking under the assault. The video ended with another message: "She's alive. For now. Tell anyone, and she dies. Every day you wait costs her another piece of her sanity. The clock is ticking." Christina vomited immediately after watching, then watched it again, and again, searching desperately for any clue about where Blaze was being held. But Rick had been thorough: no identifying features, no background sounds, nothing. Just the soul-crushing certainty that the woman she loved was suffering, and it was entirely her fault. The blackmail was elegant in its cruelty. Christina couldn't tell Sonny. Her father would tear Port Charles apart looking for Blaze, potentially getting her killed. She couldn't go to the police without revealing why Rick was targeting them. And every day that passed, she received another video, each one showing Blaze's psychological deterioration, watching her girlfriend slowly lose her grip on reality. Christina stopped sleeping. Stopped eating. Stopped functioning. Her family watched her waste away, begging her to tell them what was wrong, but she remained silent. The secret was slowly killing her, and that was exactly what Rick wanted. The master manipulator emerges. What made Rick's campaign of terror so effective was its invisibility. To the rest of Port Charles, Rick Lansing was a victim recovering from a traumatic ordeal. He attended therapy sessions, filed civil suits against his captors, and played the role of the wounded but resilient survivor. People sympathized with him, supported him, never suspecting that behind his carefully maintained facade lurked a methodical monster. Rick had learned something profound during his 30 days in captivity: true power comes not from physical strength or legal maneuvering, but from understanding human psychology and exploiting it with surgical precision. He had studied his captors during those long hours, catalogued their weaknesses, their loves, their deepest fears. And now he was using that knowledge to systematically dismantle their lives. He maintained his daily routines with obsessive precision. He had coffee at the Metro Court, attended court hearings, even visited Molly's memorial gathering when the family held one to mark her disappearance. He offered Alexis a hug, whispering, "I can't imagine what you're going through," while his eyes remained cold and empty. The psychological warfare extended beyond his primary targets. Rick began planting seeds of doubt and paranoia throughout Port Charles. An anonymous tip here, a carefully worded conversation there, each designed to turn the town's attention away from him and toward other suspects. He let slip that TJ had been investigating some dangerous characters at the hospital. He mentioned that Molly had seemed troubled in their last conversation. He created an elaborate web of misdirection that kept law enforcement chasing shadows. Ava found herself paralyzed by fear and guilt. She wanted to go to Sonny, to tell him everything and let him handle Rick the way only Sonny could. But she knew that confession meant prison, and in prison, she would be vulnerable, powerless to protect herself or anyone else from Rick's continued revenge. So she remained silent, jumping at every shadow, checking her locks obsessively, living in constant terror of what Rick would do next. Sonny Corinthos had been investigating TJ's murder independently, using his connections in the criminal underworld to gather information the police couldn't access. He had suspected from the beginning that this was more than a random crime. The timing, the brutality, the targeted nature of it all pointed to something personal. When his sources finally brought him evidence connecting the crimes to Rick, Sonny felt his world shift beneath his feet.